The most dangerous fault in North America just got louder. 382 tremors are now registering along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, climbing from 307 in only 10 days, and they have loaded into the southern end that reaches its breaking point more often than any other. Is this the warning before a magnitude 9, or is it the fault doing exactly what it always does? By the end of this video, you will know how to tell the difference, and which scenario the science actually says is coming. As of yesterday evening, the automated tracker that watches the Cascadia Subduction Zone was showing something that made the people monitoring it stop and look twice. The running count of tremor epicenters along the fault had climbed to 382. That is a significant jump, and it is the second time this month the number has spiked. 10 days earlier, on July 14th, the same tracker sat at about 307, and even that reading had already drawn attention. Now the count is higher, and it has reorganized itself in a way that matters more than the raw number does. Let me be precise about what the 382 figure actually is, because the precision is the entire story. It is a running tally on a rolling tracker, a cumulative count of individual tremor epicenters the seismic network has located along the fault over a moving window of time. It is not 382 tremors that struck in a single night. The rise of roughly 75 epicenters between the two readings happened across about 10 days. I'm spelling that out because the honest version of this story is unsettling enough without inflating it. The fault is doing more than it was 2 weeks ago, and it is doing it in one particular stretch. That stretch is the south. On July 14th, the tremor lit up the entire margin at once, from the northern end off Vancouver Island all the way down to Northern California. 10 days later, the pattern has changed. The bulk of the activity is now packed beneath the southern end of the fault, offshore Northern California and southern Oregon, with only a small amount of new tremor filling in at the far northern end, and some scattered activity under Washington. The count went up and the map tightened. Understanding why that specific reorganization is worth your attention means understanding what tremor is, what this fault is, and the single question that everyone watching it actually wants answered. The tremor we are talking about is not an earthquake, at least not the kind you would feel. It is a faint, low-frequency shuddering that comes from far underground, tens of miles below the surface, where the two plates grind past each other slowly and quietly instead of locking and snapping. Seismologists call the process episodic tremor and slip. Over days to weeks, the lower portion of the fault slides a few millimeters in near total silence, and that sliding generates the tremor signal the tracker counts. No one standing on the ground above it feels a thing. The only reason we know it is happening at all is that the instruments are sensitive enough to hear the fault whispering. This ability to hear the fault at all is recent. For most of the history of seismology, the lower part of a subduction zone was assumed to be quiet, sliding smoothly and telling us nothing. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers in Japan and the Pacific Northwest noticed a faint, rhythmic signal that did not look like any ordinary earthquake, paired with ground movement that instruments could measure but no one could feel. They realized the lower fault was slipping in slow motion on a repeating schedule, and that the tremor was the sound of that slip. Cascadia turned out to be one of the best places on the planet to study the process, which is why there's a public tracker counting these epicenters in the first place. The fault gave us a window, and we have spent barely 20 years learning to read what is on the other side of it. Here is why that whisper matters. The lower part of the Cascadia fault, the part that produces this tremor, is not the part that produces the great earthquakes. The dangerous part is higher up and closer to shore, the shallow, cold zone where the two plates are fully jammed together and have not moved at all. That locked zone is welded shut by friction, and it has been storing energy for more than 3 centuries. Every year, the plates keep converging at roughly 40 millimeters. And because the locked zone will not budge, that motion gets stored as strain, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. When the lower part of the fault slips and sends up tremor, it does 2 things at once, and this is the part that keeps seismologists up at night. It relieves stress in the lower zone, which sounds reassuring, but that same slip transfers a small additional load onto the locked zone above it, tightening the exact patch of fault that will one day produce the magnitude 9. So the tremor is not the earthquake, but it is the sound of the machine that loads the earthquake running in real time, right now, and concentrated under the segment that is closest to its breaking point. The reason the southern concentration changes the tone of this story comes down to how Cascadia is built. The fault runs about 1,000 kilometers, roughly 600 miles, from Cape Mendocino in Northern California up to the middle of Vancouver Island. Along that length, a family of oceanic plates is diving beneath North America. The Gorda Plate handles the southern end, the larger Juan de Fuca Plate to the middle, and the fragmenting Explorer Plate to the far north. They do not all behave the same way, and the southern corner is the most complicated and the most restless piece of the entire system. 3 separate forces converge on that southern corner. The Gorda Plate is being shoved down and under North America. To the west, an undersea spreading ridge is pushing on it. And the Blanco Fracture Zone, a strike-slip boundary where crust slides sideways, grinds against it from another angle. Stress arrives there from several directions at once, which is why moderate offshore earthquakes are simply normal in that area, even in a quiet year. Yesterday's tremor is stacking onto a corner of the planet that is already the busiest part of one of the most dangerous faults on Earth. The Gorda Plate itself is part of what makes the corner so active. Unlike a rigid slab that dives cleanly, the Gorda Plate is small, warm, and internally deforming, cracking and bending under the squeeze from all sides rather than sliding as one clean piece. That internal breaking produces earthquakes of its own, separate from the main boundary between the plates, which is part of why the southern offshore area logs moderate shocks so routinely. Sorting out which of those earthquakes come from inside the deforming plate and which come from the locked boundary is a constant task for the people watching this region. And it is exactly the kind of distinction that matters when a new cluster shows up where it did yesterday. And there was a companion signal, too. The day before the tracker reading, on or about July 23rd, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck offshore that same southern region, in the Gorda and Blanco zone, following a couple of smaller shocks earlier in the day. On its own, a magnitude 4.2 out there is unremarkable. In context, alongside a tremor count that just concentrated into the same area, it reads as part of a broader pattern of stress working its way down across the southern end of the fault. None of this is a countdown, but all of it is pointing at the same place. The other reason the South matters is written in the fault's own history. The southern margin of Cascadia does not wait as long between earthquakes as the northern margin does. Its average repeat time is on the order of 240 years, compared with roughly 500 years for a full-length rupture of the whole fault. By the geologic record, the southern end reaches its breaking point more often, and right now it is statistically closer to its average than any other part of the margin. Scientists who study the southern segment, sometimes labeled segment D, estimate it can produce an earthquake up to about magnitude 8.3 all by itself, without the rest of the fault joining in. And they put the odds of that southern segment rupturing within the next 50 years at somewhere between 37 and 43%. Read that again. It is not a small number. A better than 1 in 3 chance of a magnitude 8 class earthquake off Northern California and Southern Oregon within the lifetime of most people watching this. That figure comes from paleoseismic work published in 2012, and it has held up. It helps to know where those numbers come from, because they are not guesses. Like when a great earthquake ruptures offshore, it shakes loose underwater landslides that send sediment cascading down the continental slope, leaving a distinct layer on the seafloor. Stack up thousands of years of those layers in a sediment core, and you get a physical calendar of past ruptures. One muddy page per earthquake. Researchers at Oregon State University spent years reading those cores up and down the margin, and the pattern they found is what tells us the southern end ruptures more often than the north. The southern segment has passed roughly 85% of its historical repeat times, which is a formal way of saying that most of its past intervals were shorter than the wait we are already in. So when the tremor count climbs and then loads itself into the southern segment, it is highlighting the part of the fault that already had the shortest fuse and the highest near-term odds. The monitoring read, "Yesterday said this plainly. The nearer-term danger is a southern partial rupture, a magnitude 8 class event confined to the south, and that scenario is more probable in the short run than the full margin magnitude 9 that gets all the headlines. The full rupture is still possible, and it would be far worse, but the south is where the odds are leaning." Now, I have to be honest with you about the limits of what any of this can tell us, because this is exactly where a lot of coverage goes wrong. An elevated tremor count does not predict when the earthquake will happen. It never has, anywhere on Earth. There's no validated method that converts a tremor count into a date, or a month, or a year. Tremor episodes happen along Cascadia on a regular cycle, roughly every 14 months beneath northern Washington and southern Vancouver Island, and on longer intervals elsewhere, and the overwhelming majority of them are followed by nothing at all. That regularity is itself a clue about how to read the current spike. Because these episodes recur on a rough schedule, a rising count is often just the fault entering another one of its normal cycles, running its course over a few weeks, and then going quiet again. The instruments have only been watching closely for about 2 decades, which is a blink next to the 300-year rhythm of the great earthquakes, so we are still building the baseline of what normal even looks like. A number that seems alarming today may turn out to be ordinary once we have watched the fault through many more of its cycles. That uncertainty cuts both ways. and it is why the next few readings matter more than this single one. Think of the tremor as a gauge on the side of the machine, not an alarm clock. It shows you the engine is running and roughly how hard. It shows you where the load is being applied. What it cannot show you is the moment the locked zone will finally give way, because that moment depends on the strength of a patch of rock miles underwater that we cannot measure directly. The gauge is real, the reading is elevated, and the load is landing on the worst possible segment. And still, the gauge does not tell time. This is the part that gets distorted the most, so let me say it as directly as I can. Anyone telling you the tremor means the big one is days or weeks away is wrong, and the science does not support it. The slow slip far underground is decoupled from the timing of the shallow rupture. But the opposite spin is just as wrong. The people saying this is nothing, the fault does this all the time, ignore me, are also missing it. Both readings fail because they want a simple answer, and Cascadia does not give simple answers. There is a genuine scientific paradox sitting underneath this, and it is worth understanding because it explains why smart people look at the same tremor and reach opposite conclusions. Frequent tremor from the lower fault can be read two ways, and both readings are defensible with the data we have. The first reading is reassuring. The slow slip is a pressure release valve. Every time the lower zone slides a little, it vents stress that might otherwise build, keeping the system from binding up. By that logic, more tremor is the fault breathing normally, letting off pressure in small, survivable increments. The second reading is the opposite. That same slip does not vent stress from the locked zone, it delivers stress to it. Each episode transfers a little more load onto the shallow patch that produces the great earthquake, winding the spring tighter. By that logic, more tremor means the dangerous part of the fault is being loaded faster. The uncomfortable truth is that surface measurements alone cannot separate the safe venting interpretation from the quiet loading interpretation. We are watching the same signal that could mean two contradictory things, and we do not yet have the tools underwater to know which one is winning. That is not a failure of the scientists. It is the honest edge of what the current instruments can resolve, and it is precisely why no responsible seismologist will convert this reading into a prediction. What would settle it is better eyes on the locked zone itself, and that is slowly coming. Networks of seafloor sensors, planted directly above the offshore fault, are being expanded to measure the strain on the shallow patch, instead of inferring it from land stations hundreds of miles away. Until those measurements mature, the venting versus loading question stays open, and the tremor count stays exactly what it is, a real signal we can see clearly and interpret only partly. To understand the stakes, you have to go back to the last time this fault let go completely. It ruptured along its full length on January 26th, in the year 1700, in an earthquake now estimated at magnitude 9.0. The rupture tore roughly 1,000 kilometers of the fault at once, with the two plates lurching an average of about 19 meters, more than 60 feet. That was 326 years ago. We know the date that precisely because of one of the great pieces of detective work in earth science. The 1700 earthquake sent a tsunami across the entire Pacific that struck the coast of Honshu, Japan, about 9 to 10 hours later, where villagers and temple record keepers wrote down the arrival of a wave that came with no earthquake to explain it. Centuries later, scientists matched those Japanese records to drowned groves of red cedar and Sitka spruce along the Pacific Northwest coast, forests that were killed all at once when the land dropped during the quake. Tree ring death dates and indigenous oral histories filled in the rest. A tsunami with no local earthquake in Japan and ghost forests with no recorded cause in America turned out to be two halves of the same night. That is the event Cascadia is capable of producing, and it is the clock the current tremor count is being measured against. 326 years of silence is not just a long time. It is longer than almost every gap in the fault's recorded history. Here is where I want to be careful, because the word overdue does a lot of misleading work. Over roughly the past 6,000 years, only about 2 intervals between major Cascadia earthquakes lasted longer than the 326 years we have already waited. Stretch the window to 10,000 years, and 8 of 41 intervals ran longer. And across the past 4,000 years, the single longest gap between major earthquakes was about 291 years, a number the current silence has already passed. By that measure, we are in unusually long territory. But overdue implies a clock that ticks on a schedule, and the paleoseismic record does not tick that way. The intervals are irregular. Some analyses argue the pattern is closer to random than to clockwork, which would make overdue a misleading word entirely. Other researchers, working from the sediment layers left by past ruptures, argue the southern segment genuinely is running hot. Both of those views come from honest scientists reading the same data. None of that framing debate should distract from the one quantity that is not in dispute. The plates are still converging at about 40 millimeters a year, and the locked zone offshore is still fully jammed. That means strain has been accumulating on the shallow fault every single year for 326 years, with nowhere to go. Whether you call the fault overdue or simply loaded, the energy stored in that patch of rock is real. It is enormous, and it grows a little more every day the fault stays quiet. The argument is about timing. The loading is not up for argument. There is even a live dispute about how that data gets presented to the public. The main hazard tracking site that many people follow recently removed several older explanatory pages and replaced them with a single page built around 2025 research, one that introduced some longer interval figures, a 410-year mark and a 350-year figure, drawn from the longer 10,000-year window. Some observers read that as quietly softening the "we are past due" message. It is worth being clear about what changed and what did not. The underlying record of past earthquakes did not change. What changed is which window and which numbers a public site chose to show. Two honest scientists can frame the same fault as alarming or as merely watchful, depending on where they start the clock. Set the probabilities aside for a moment and look at the thing itself, because the scale is what makes this fault matter more than almost any other hazard on the continent. A full margin magnitude 9 would shake the Pacific Northwest for 4 to 6 minutes. Not seconds, minutes. Long enough that people who have lived through ordinary earthquakes describe the modeled scenario as almost impossible to imagine. The reason the shaking lasts so long comes down to the size of the rupture. In a smaller earthquake, a short section of fault breaks, and the shaking is over in seconds. In a full Cascadia rupture, the break races along 1,000 kilometers of fault, and every part of it keeps radiating energy as it goes. The ground does not jolt once and stop. It rolls and keeps rolling for as long as it takes the rupture to travel the entire margin. Older buildings that might survive 15 seconds of shaking would face minutes of it instead, and that duration is a large part of what turns a strong earthquake into a region-changing one. The tsunami would follow fast. First waves would reach the outer coast within roughly 15 to 30 minutes of the rupture. Far too little time to drive inland, which is why coastal residents are told to move uphill on foot the moment the shaking stops. Run-up on exposed stretches could reach several tens of feet. And during the quake itself, long sections of coastline could drop 3 to 6 feet in an instant, sinking the land right as the water arrives and deepening the flooding. The federal planning scenario has long cited on the order of 14,000 deaths across Oregon and Washington. Washington's own emergency management study from 2025 argues the federal number is too low, with some agency figures now reaching toward 25,000 fatalities, tens of thousands injured, and economic losses above $30 billion. Worse still if coastal evacuations are delayed even 10 minutes. On the order of 1 million people could be displaced. Water, power, and roads west of the Interstate 5 corridor could be down for weeks to months. A regional emergency official once summarized the outer coast forecast in 4 blunt words: that everything west of Interstate 5 would be, in his phrase, toast. That is the full margin event. It is the low probability, high consequence tail of what this fault can do. The scenario the current tremor is actually pointing toward is the smaller one, and smaller is a relative word here. A southern partial rupture in the magnitude 8 class would not level the entire Northwest, but it would be a catastrophe for Northern California and Southern Oregon. It would bring its own tsunami to that coast, its own violent shaking and days to weeks of severed roads, power, and water for the communities nearest the southern segment. And by the odds, it is the more probable near-term Cascadia earthquake, exactly the outcome the concentration of southern tremor and that companion magnitude 4.2 are most consistent with. I want to connect that back to the number we started with. 382 tremors, climbing and loading into the south, is not a prediction that the southern segment will rupture. It is a readout showing that the segment with the shortest fuse and the highest near-term odds is the one currently taking on stress. That is why this reading is worth your attention and not your panic. The right response is not fear. It is the boring, effective stuff. If you live in the zone, have an earthquake plan, know your route to high ground, and keep supplies for the days when the lifelines are down. That preparedness point is not a throwaway line, because the southern scenario has a cruel feature. The communities along the northern California and southern Oregon coast are smaller and more spread out than the big cities to the north, with fewer hospitals, longer roads, and more bridges that a magnitude 8 could sever in seconds. An earthquake, the rest of the country might treat as a regional story, could isolate those towns for days before help arrives. Knowing your own route to high ground and your own plan for the first 72 hours matters most exactly where the odds are highest. And right now, that is the southern end of this fault. The next tracker readings will settle the immediate question. If the southern tremor keeps intensifying and starts migrating upward toward the locked zone, That is the pattern seismologists will watch most closely. If it settles back down as this episode of slow slip runs its course, then this was another cycle of the machine doing what it does. Either way, we will know more within weeks, not years, because the instruments update continuously. Watch the far north too. The stretch off Vancouver Island that just started registering tremor again is the same area where a magnitude 5.6 struck less than a week ago, on the night of July 19th into the 20th. That one turned out to be a strike-slip earthquake inside the fracturing Explorer plate, not the megathrust, so it is not a sign the locked zone is failing. But whether new activity there migrates from the oceanic plate toward the main fault is the detail that would change the northern assessment. Here is the honest bottom line. We can now watch, almost in real time, the engine that loads the most dangerous fault in North America. We can count the tremors, map where they cluster, and measure the strain piling up since 1700. And the better our instruments get, the more precisely we can describe a fault we still cannot schedule. The count rising again is not the fault announcing its arrival. It is the fault breathing. And from the breathing alone, we still cannot tell whether it is resting or getting ready. We will be watching the next readings closely, and we will tell you the moment they change.